History books often glorify kings as wise rulers, brave warriors, or fathers of their nations. We see them crowned in gold, sitting on thrones, holding symbols of justice and order. But behind those crowns often hid men whose personal lives were filled with darkness, cruelty, and disturbing desires. For some, their habits were so shocking that even their closest servants whispered about them in fear. These kings did not rule with dignity. They ruled with obsession, vice, and often madness. In this story, we will step away from the polished portraits and shining monuments. Instead, we will walk into the private chambers of rulers who believed their power gave them the right to do anything. These kings forced their twisted habits on their courts, their families, and sometimes entire nations. Some found pleasure in bizarre rituals. Others carried out cruel punishments for their amusement. A few became so consumed by obsession that they destroyed their own health and kingdoms. From kings who bathed in blood, to monarchs who dined on the strangest foods, to rulers who turned their kingdoms into theaters of cruelty, the habits you are about to hear reveal the disturbing side of power. And yet each of these kings was respected in public, feared in private, and remembered in history for both greatness and madness. But before we begin, one question lingers. How much of their cruelty came from madness, and how much was encouraged by the very system that made them untouchable? The first king we will meet was a ruler of France, brilliant on the battlefield, but terrifying at night. His habit would earn him the nickname the Mad. France in the late 14th century was already scarred by war, plague, and famine. But nothing unsettled the nation more than the madness of King Charles VI, known as Charles the Mad. At first, Charles seemed destined to be a strong ruler. He came to the throne at just 11 years old, but by his 20s he was admired for his energy, generosity, and charm. People believed he might restore France's dignity after the chaos of the 100 Years' War. Yet behind the glittering courtly image, something far darker was beginning to unravel. Charles's episodes of madness struck suddenly and violently. One of the earliest incidents happened in 1392. While marching with his army, he suddenly turned on his own men in a frenzy, sloshing and killing several of his loyal knights before collapsing in exhaustion. From that moment forward, his grip on reality deteriorated. At times, Charles believed he was made entirely of glass. He demanded to be wrapped in blankets or reinforced clothing so he wouldn't shatter. He refused to be touched, fearing even the slightest contact might break him into pieces. Courtiers were forbidden to come too close, and he spent long stretches of time in complete isolation. This strange glass delusion left France without a functioning king, while rival nobles and factions schemed to control the throne. Even more disturbing, Charles often forgot who he was. On several occasions, he wandered the palace corridors, insisting he was not the king at all, but a simple peasant or another man entirely. When courtiers bowed to him, he stared blankly, sometimes screaming in confusion. His own queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, was powerless to manage his frequent breakdowns. France descended into a dangerous power vacuum. The people of France whispered in fear. Was their king cursed, possessed, punished by God? While some pitied him, others saw his madness as a symbol of France's decline. Nobles fought over his authority, and foreign powers took advantage of the instability. Charles's reign stretched for decades, but much of it was consumed by his illness. By the time of his death in 1422, France was in shambles, and his strange and tragic behavior had become legendary. For many, Charles VI was not just a king with disturbing habits. He was a living reminder of how fragile even the most powerful ruler could be. But Charles was not the only monarch with behaviors that shocked his people. Another king's disturbing habits weren't rooted in madness, but in sheer cruelty, and his name would echo in history for the terror he unleashed. If there was ever a king whose habits crossed into the realm of the bizarre and tragic, it was King Charles VI of France, known to history as Charles the Mad. His reign in the late 14th century was marred, not just by political turmoil, but by his deeply disturbing personal delusions. At the height of his madness, Charles became convinced that his body was made entirely of glass. He feared that the slightest touch, or even a fall, would shatter him into countless pieces. This strange belief dictated every part of his daily life. He wore specially reinforced clothing padded with layers of cloth to protect his fragile glass body. courtiers were forbidden to touch him, and Charles would sometimes sit frozen in place, afraid to move, terrified that even walking across the room would lead to his destruction. Servants tiptoed around him, careful not to upset the fragile balance of his mind. What's worse, he reportedly forced his attendants to handle him with extreme care, as though he were a delicate vase instead of a human king. But his paranoia went further. At times, Charles forgot who he was, screaming in confusion, wandering the halls of his palaces, or attacking his own men in violent fits of rage. Once, he even killed several of his knights during a psychotic episode, convinced they were traitors plotting against him. This unpredictable behavior made him both feared and pitied. The French court struggled to cover up his instability, but whispers of his glass delusion spread across Europe. Some saw it as divine punishment, others as proof that the French monarchy itself was crumbling. Yet, despite his illness, Charles was still the king, and the kingdom suffered under his inability to rule effectively. France's enemies took advantage of his instability, and his own subjects lost faith in the crown. The image of a king wrapped in layers of fabric, trembling with fear that he might shatter, remains one of the most haunting examples of royal fragility and madness. Charles's disturbing habits blurred the line between human suffering and grotesque spectacle, leaving behind a legacy that still fascinates and horrifies historians today. But Charles VI was not alone in his strangeness. Across Europe and beyond, other kings indulged in habits just as grotesque, shocking, and sometimes downright revolting. From obsessions with blood to unthinkable dining practices, the pages of royal history are filled with rulers who behaved more like monsters than monarchs. Up next, a king who bathed in blood, convinced it was the secret to eternal strength. If there was ever a king whose mind was more terrifying than his crown, it was King Charles VI of France. Known to history as Charles the Mad, he ruled during the late 14th and early 15th centuries, a time when France was already drowning in the 100 Years' War. But instead of providing stability, Charles brought fear and chaos, not just to his enemies, but to his own court and family. His disturbing habits weren't eccentric quirks. They were evidence of a mind unraveling in front of an entire kingdom. One of the most shocking episodes occurred in 1392, when Charles suddenly erupted into violence while marching with his army. Believing his own knights were traitors, he drew his sword and killed several of them on the spot. From then on, episodes of madness defined his reign. Charles developed strange delusions, including believing he was made entirely of glass. He ordered special clothing reinforced with iron rods, so no one would accidentally shatter him. Courtiers were forbidden from touching him for fear that the king might break. His paranoia worsened over the years. Sometimes he ran screaming through the palace halls, unable to recognize even his wife or children. Other times, he sat motionless for hours, staring into space, refusing to bathe or change his clothes. There were even stretches where he completely forgot he was king, insisting that he was a simple commoner named George. In these periods, he would push away royal robes, calling them lies, and demand to work as a peasant. Perhaps the darkest moment came during what is now called the Bal des Ardents, the Ball of the Burning Men. In 1393, Charles joined courtiers dressed as wild men for a masquerade. Their costumes were coated in pitch and flax to look like fur. But when a torch was accidentally dropped, the men caught fire instantly, or burned alive before the horrified court. Charles survived only because his aunt threw her skirts over him to smother the flames. What was meant to be entertainment became a gruesome spectacle, cementing his image as a cursed monarch. For his people, Charles was both pitied and feared. His madness left France vulnerable, and rival nobles used his condition to seize power. Rumors spread that he was possessed, cursed, or even punished by God for the sins of his ancestors. His queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, took control during his absences. But her rule was riddled with corruption, adding to the kingdom's despair. Charles's reign shows the haunting reality of monarchy. A crown could not shield a king from his own mind. His disturbing habits, believing he was glass, forgetting he was king. Lashing out violently turned his life into a nightmare, and his country into a fractured battlefield. But he was not alone. Across Europe and Asia, other rulers harbored equally unsettling habits, sometimes born of madness, sometimes of cruelty, and one such king made his meals into acts of horror, treating the dinner table as a stage for fear. Some monarchs believed that ruling was not just about power, but also about mastering death itself. One such king, Frederick William I of Prussia, developed a chilling habit that disturbed even those closest to him. Obsessed with the idea of mortality, he reportedly slept in coffins to prepare himself for the inevitable end. His servants whispered that he would spend long nights lying inside the wooden box, staring at the ceiling in silence, as if rehearsing his own funeral. But this habit was not just a morbid fascination. It terrified his court, especially since he would invite officials to stand near him as he lay inside, forcing them to face their own fears. Many saw it as a cruel form of psychological control, reminding everyone that the king could dictate not only their lives but also their thoughts about death. Frederick William's strange obsession reflected the darker side of his reign. Though known for building a powerful army and strict discipline, his nightly ritual gave him an aura of dread. To his subjects, he became both a symbol of strength and a shadow of madness. Even his family admitted they felt uneasy walking past his chambers, never sure if he was asleep in his bed or rehearsing his burial once again. What was more unsettling was how this macabre practice seeped into his decisions. He often spoke about life as a temporary stage, reminding his ministers that their loyalty should last beyond the grave. For many, this blurred the line between faith, fear, and tyranny. And yet, Frederick William was not the only ruler to indulge in bizarre nighttime rituals. Another king. A strange obsession was far more shocking, one that turned his dining table into a grotesque display of power. King Charles VI of France, often called Charles the Mad, lived a life torn between brilliance and madness. Early in his reign, he was seen as a promising leader. But as time passed, his mind began to unravel, plunging his court and his kingdom into chaos. His disturbing habits were not just unusual, they were terrifying to those around him. Charles suffered from recurring fits of insanity that grew worse with age. One of his most bizarre beliefs was that he was made of glass. He lived in constant fear that he might shatter into pieces if touched or jostled. To protect himself, he wore reinforced clothing and refused to let others come too close. His servants had to handle him gently, as though he were a fragile object, not the King of France. But this was only one layer of his instability. During his episodes, Charles often failed to recognize his own family. He attacked servants without warning, sometimes believing they were enemies sent to kill him. On more than one occasion, he ran through the palace halls screaming, convinced that assassins lurked behind every corner. One infamous incident occurred during a military campaign in 1392. While leading his army, Charles suddenly turned on his own men, striking them down with his sword in a blind frenzy. Several soldiers were killed before he was subdued. Afterward, he remembered nothing, leaving his commanders horrified and uncertain of their ruler's sanity. These outbursts crippled France. While Charles was incapacitated, rival factions fought to control the throne, sparking civil war, and weakening the kingdom during a crucial time in the 100 Years' War against England. His madness became not just a personal curse, but a national tragedy. To his courtiers, Charles VI was a living reminder of how fragile power could be. They never knew which version of the king they would face, calm and rational, or violent and delusional. The image of the monarch who thought himself made of glass became one of the most haunting legacies of medieval royalty. And yet Charles was not alone in such disturbing habits. Across Europe and beyond, other kings indulged in behaviors that blurred the line between eccentricity and cruelty. Some hid behind madness, while others displayed their darkness openly, turning their courts into stages for shocking acts. What kind of king could surpass even Charles VI in his disturbing rituals? The answer lies in one who redefined fear itself, Vlad the Impaler. Among Europe's most peculiar rulers was King Charles VI of France. Known as Charles the Mad, his reign in the late 14th century was marked by paranoia, hallucinations, and terrifying rituals. One of his darkest habits was his obsession with death. He often believed he was made of glass and might shatter at the slightest touch. But even more disturbing, he sometimes slept in coffins, convinced it would prepare him for the afterlife. This morbid practice horrified his courtiers, who feared the king had lost all sense of reality. He would order candles placed around the coffin, as though performing his own funeral. For hours he would lie inside, pale and silent, muttering prayers. Some historians suggest this ritual was rooted in medieval traditions of memento mori, reminders of mortality. For a king, the sight was unsettling. Instead of projecting power, Charles appeared fragile, haunted, and broken. His madness took darker turns. During public events, he would forget who he was, attacking his own knights or wandering the palace claiming he was a wolf. Combined with his coffin ritual, it gave the impression of a man already half dead, ruling a kingdom in fear. France, caught in the 100 Years' War, desperately needed strength, but its monarch was disappearing into shadows of his own mind. The coffin's leaping habit became a symbol of the king's collapse. Nobles whispered that he had been cursed or possessed. Priests tried exorcisms while doctors bled him, but nothing worked. France suffered not only from war, but from the eerie spectacle of a monarch rehearsing his death night after night. This strange and chilling ritual made Charles VI one of history's most unsettling kings, remembered less for victories and more for the haunting image of a ruler who chose to live like a corpse before his time. King George IV of Britain was not remembered for his wisdom, but for his gluttony and vanity. Nicknamed the First Gentleman of Europe, he was obsessed with appearances, fine dining, and endless indulgence. But behind the polished clothes and powdered face was a man consumed by excess. He reportedly ate 6 meals a day, each filled with rich meats, pastries, and rivers of wine. At his banquets, tables sagged under roasted swans, pies stuffed with whole animals, and desserts soaked in brandy. He would eat until he was nearly sick, then lean back and demand more. His waistline grew so large that he had to be lifted into bed with a special crane. By the end of his life, he was so obese he could barely walk. George's vanity was equally disturbing. Obsessed with how he looked, he wore corsets to squeeze his body into fashionable shapes, even when it caused him pain. He spent fortunes on perfumes, wigs, and glittering costumes. But his vanity wasn't harmless. It drained the royal treasury, while common people starved. His habits shocked even his closest advisors. Ambassadors visiting his court whispered about his inability to control himself, while caricatures of him as a bloated, greedy pig circulated in London. Some historians argue that his endless indulgence symbolized the decay of monarchy itself. As a king who ruled not with strength but with appetite, but his gluttony was not just personal, it was political. George's excess became a metaphor for a corrupt and bloated empire, feasting on wealth while ignoring the suffering of ordinary citizens. In the end, his life was cut short by his own habits. He died in 1830, weighed down by his own indulgence, both literally and symbolically. And yet, George IV was not alone. Across Europe, kings turned their bodies and appetites into disturbing spectacles, some obsessed over food, others over torture, others over bizarre rituals of power. The throne was not only a seat of rule, it was often a stage for the darkest corners of human desire. But one king, far to the north, would disturb Europe in an entirely different way. His obsession wasn't with food or vanity, but with cruelty itself, using his power to invent new forms of terror. History remembers rulers not only for their victories and power, but also for their strange, disturbing habits that defined their reigns. From the Roman emperors who indulged in cruelty and perversion, to kings who obsessed over blood rituals, and monarchs who filled their palaces with bizarre collections, these men left a legacy that was often darker than their political achievements. These kings remind us of the dangers of unchecked power. With no one to stop them, their private obsessions became public spectacles. Their people lived in fear, sometimes forced to witness their monarchs' twisted games. For many, the palace was not a place of glory, but of dread. But perhaps the most haunting truth is that behind the crown, these rulers were still human, flawed, fragile, and often broken. Their disturbing habits did not just come from power, but from their own insecurities, traumas, and desires. In the end, history does not only record the battles they won, but also the darkness they carried inside. And so, when we look back at these kings, we see not just leaders, but cautionary tales. Their habits remind us how absolute power can twist even the strongest into something unrecognizable. And their stories, strange and chilling, continue to echo through time,